What's going on, Raven Gang? It is by popular demand that I am making a video on how I maintain my Pacific Northwest logging boots. Like with other high quality leather work boots out there, these do require a relatively high level of maintenance if you want to get as much life out of these boots as possible. The boots that I have are made by the Frank's Boot Company. They are the Type 1 Commanders. They're made on the number 4 last. I've had them for a little over 2 years now. The last year or so I've been really tough on these boots. I've put them through rain, slush, mud, fire ash, so there is definitely some areas that we're going to focus on in the upcoming maintenance. Definitely going to put some new laces on here. I've broken these things a couple times and retying them has started to become kind of a pain in the butt. We're not going to worry too much about the sole and the heel. There's just not that much wear there to be concerned about. However, on the heel stack and the welt, it's a little scuffed up, a little scraped up and scratched, so we're definitely going to put some edge dressing on there, wax it up a little bit, clean everything up, and make it look pretty nice. So without further ado, we'll go into the materials that we're going to be using for this maintenance. Some of these items might seem a little exotic, but if you do a lot of boot maintenance, they're definitely worth it to get. First off, we have a stiff bristle brush, nothing crazy, just enough to get all the excess dirt and grime off of your boots before you clean it. Paired with that, we're also going to use a little bit of Kiwi saddle soap just to clean everything up. In addition to the first brush, I also have a stiff bristled narrow brush, kind of like a toothbrush, just to get into those tight crevices. And to finish off, we just have a regular Kiwi horsehair brush. This one might raise some eyebrows, but trust the process. We're going to use some medium grit sandpaper. In this instance, I'm using 120 grit. We're going to be using some Fiebings leather stain. I'm using Walnut. And just to do a final seal on the welt and the heel stack, we're just going to use a little bit of 100% beeswax. Although, if you have a different wax that you have for your own mix, that works too. I do like using a wooden burnishing stick just to smooth out that welt and finish it up pretty nice. When it comes to leather conditioners, I'm going to be using Hubberds shoe grease. I like how deep it penetrates. It's worked out the best for me. I've used other conditioners in the past, like Obanoff's LP. However, I don't necessarily like how it always wears off pretty easy. Doesn't really penetrate that deep. I've even tried making my own out of a mixture of beeswax, coconut oil, and lard with, mixed results. However, at the end of the day, I always go back to Hubberds shoe grease. Not always necessary, but necessary in this case, just a brand new pair of laces. So without further ado, let's get into the maintenance. First step, you're obviously going to take out your laces and your false tongues, or kilties as some people call them. If you don't have those, well, you don't have to worry about this step. Go ahead and set your laces aside or throw them away depending on the condition or whatever you want to do. This is a great example of all the sawdust, dirt, and grime that can get caught underneath your uppers and those kilties. Here's a pro tip. In the past, I've actually confused which one is left or right for these kilties, so I've started to actually take a pen and write L or R on these things just so I remember which boot they actually go to, because sometimes when you condition these things, you just can't tell, so you never can be too sure. After you take your laces and kilties out, you're definitely going to want to go outside for this portion, or if you can't, go ahead and hover above a trash can. You're going to get that stiff bristle brush and just go to town on these boots. Pay special attention to the actual seam of the welt and the uppers. Get in all those little tight crevices. If you have rough out uppers, just go ahead and go to town on that nap. Raise up all those grains, just get all that dirt and dust as much as you can off of those boots. Now you can already see how much these boots are starting to look a little bit better. Generally, if I get these boots dirty or muddy, I'll just brush them off and end it right there. However, we're going to go a lot deeper than that. Next up, we're going to move on to actually cleaning these boots, and we're going to bust open that can of Kiwi saddle soap right there. This is a brand new can. Generally, it's a little bit more messed up. You're only going to want to fill the top tin lid with a little bit of water because you don't want to oversaturate these boots. If I get a little bit more water than that, I know that I've gone too far. Just dip your brush in there. We're using that narrow brush. Lather it around in your soap. Give it a couple more dips in that water, and you should have a little bit of suds forming on that brush. And as soon as you see that, then you know that you have the proper amount. And from there, you can start scrubbing your boots. Now, I will say that there is a disclaimer on the saddle soap that says you're not supposed to use it on rough out or suede. However, in my experience, that generally comes down to a cosmetic thing. Like if you use it on suede, sometimes it'll change the color just because there's conditioners inside the saddle soap. However, we're not really concerned about all that because we're going to immediately condition these boots. However, if you were worried about the color of your boots, definitely don't use saddle soap. With that saddle soap, just start rubbing it in, scrubbing away at all those little nooks and crannies all over the outside of your boot. I definitely pay close attention to that welt heel stack and sole and all that, and I get in that little seam that's in the upper and the sole, get all that dirt out of there. A lot of people forget, but you got to get that tongue gusset in the inside of your boot because a lot of dirt likes to hang out in there, as we saw at the very beginning. Now this is a very important part. Get an old towel and wipe down the outside of your boot and get all of that excess saddle soap off of the outside of your boot as much as you can. Once you do that, if you have kilties or false tongues, go ahead and repeat that same process on these, followed by wiping them down with the towel. Once you get done with the saddle soap, it is very important to let these things fully dry out, so we're going to set these things aside for 24 hours and then come back. 24 hours has passed, which gives us a great look at these boots and how they look when they're clean, and we can clearly see that that heel stack and welt is pretty exhausted on these boots. So we're going to move on and we're going to go ahead and address that, and for that we're going to go ahead and use that 120 grit sandpaper that we talked about at the very beginning. You can really use any sandpaper you want, just make sure it's not a super aggressive grit, like you don't want to use 36 grit. We're just going to lightly go over the heel stack and the welt, not trying to remove any material, but we're just going to lightly sand and try to even out all those big deep scuffs that are on there and try to make an even surface. If there's any leftover wax or buildup or residue left on those welts, make sure you take your sandpaper to that and try to get as much of that off as possible. Here's a good look at the sole. Like I said, we're not trying to do any crazy material removal. We're just trying to even everything out and remove a little bit of the excess old finish. After that, you're going to take your regular horsehair brush and give those soles a very good brushing. Get rid of as much of that sanding dust as you possibly can. Now that your sole's all brushed off, you're going to take your Fiebings leather stain and very carefully paint on the leather stain on the outside portions of your sole, making very sure that you don't get any of that stain on your upper leather. After a couple coats, you should have a welt that looks something like this. You can put on more coats if you want to, but I think 2 or 3 is sufficient. Now I didn't mention this at the very beginning of it, but sometimes I'll use a Fiebing edge dressing. This one is in dark walnut. You can go ahead and use it the exact same way that you just used the leather stain. However, when I use this, I generally put it on there at the very end just because it has a little bit of paraffin wax in it and it protects that heel and welt a little bit better than just your leather stain. An important difference if you do use the edge dressing is if you put it on, make sure you wipe it off afterwards, or else that paraffin wax is going to cure on that rubber of your sole and it's going to be an absolute pain to get off. After we put that edge dressing on there, we have a nice little sheen on there where that wax is cured. So once that's on there, just go ahead and set those boots aside, make sure that wax is fully cured before you move on to the next step. Now this step here is pretty much for the sake of redundancy, or if you didn't use the edge dressing and you just use the leather stain, I would definitely do this. I'm just going to take beeswax and I'm just going to rub it on all that exposed leather, making sure to work it in as much as I can, going around the outside of the welt, focusing on that heel stack, and just absolutely go into town to get as much beeswax on there as possible. Afterwards, I'm going to take that horsehair brush yet again and just give that a very nice brush to get all that loose flaky beeswax off of the outside of your welt. Finishing off, we're going to use a wooden burnishing stick just to take it and go around the outside of that welt, smooth everything out, work it all in there, make sure it's a really nice even surface. This is the exact same technique that people that make leather holsters and different things like that use to finish the edge of that leather. Once the edge is nice and burnished, go ahead and hit it with that horsehair brush one more time just to make everything as smooth as possible, because we're trying to keep the sole waterproof and keep any of those upper leather conditioners that we're going to be using on the top of the boot from penetrating into the sole leather, which could weaken it. Now that we're finished with the sole, we're going to bust out that Hubberds shoe grease and we're going to work on conditioning the rest of the boot. Now if you've never used Hubberds before, it has a slightly greasy consistency, and because of all the pine tar that's in it, it definitely smells like you're sitting downwind of a campfire, so it's definitely got that smoky smell. It's not off-putting, but it is unique. When it comes to the shoe grease, a little bit definitely goes a long way, so you're not trying to overload the leather and oversaturate it. Just get your fingertips in there, get a little bit on, work it in one spot, rub it in, move on to a different spot, come back, put a little bit more on, and go from there. Definitely don't forget to condition the inside of your tongue gusset and all the seams and the eyelets that are in there. There's a lot of stitch lines and it is a very high wear area. Now I do use that little thin brush that we used at the very beginning for the saddle soap. This is after it's been cleaned, just to go around the welt and all the seams that are around the outside sole of the boot, just because I can't get my fingers in there. And I'll also do the same thing for all the seam and stitch lines, just so I can work in that Hubberds a little bit better than if I would have just used my fingers. Now after you brush the grease into the welt and stitch lines, just go ahead and work all that excess in with your fingers, set the boots aside, and we can work on the kilties. Now when it comes to the kilties, I don't do anything crazy. I just give them a couple quick swipes of the shoe grease on either side, then I just work it and massage it with my fingertips until it's all fully saturated. After it's all said and done, just make sure you get an old rag and you wipe off any of the excess Hubberds that's built up on the surface of your boots and your kilties. Finally, we can get to the laces. Now with the laces, these are brand new laces. These are from Nick's, they're not from Frank's. However, I will just get a little bit of that Hubberds in my fingertips and I will just run the laces down the entire length, once or twice a piece. That'll condition them and they will be good to go to thread into the boots. After that, you are good to lace everything back up. Let's see how we did. I am definitely pleased with how these came out. Now when it comes to boot maintenance, as with everything else, everybody has their own opinion. This is my method, it's worked out pretty well for me so far. But if you have any different ideas or opinions, go ahead and share them down in the comments below and I'll check them out. But besides that, thank you for watching, comment, rate, subscribe. I appreciate all of you.